welcome to Take Two, the show that looks at the issues behind the news. I'm Henshall. Today we have some news shorts you may have missed, and I'll be talking to Fran Anderson on the situation in Venezuela. After that we have legal expert Chis Covendale on the illegality of war. Secret UK lab helped expose media lies and stop another war. Legendary US investigative reporter Seymour Hersh has come up with another bombshell when Obama, Kerry and Haig tried to start a war with Syria last September. They already knew that the chemical weapons attack they were using as a pretext was likely to be a false flag attack by their own allies, the Turks. Hersh, one of the best journalists on the planet, has only been able to publish his report in the small circulation London Review of Books. Perhaps because the NATO media, too, were complicit in the lies. At the time, they ignored evidence the story might be a warmongering scam, and since then they have failed to correct the record. Hersh explains that the attacks were stopped by a cautious US military who had been informed by the UK's Porton Down Chemical Warfare Laboratory that samples taken from Syria did not match up to Syrian government chemical warfare stocks. According to Hersh, the culprit was most likely Turkey, where senior officials were recently caught on tape planning another false flag, as we reported in the last edition of Take Two. Under its erratic leader Recep Erdogan, Turkey is seen by more moderate NATO partners as a serious force for destabilisation of the Middle East, reports Hersh, who has excellent contacts in the US military. Officials he has talked to believe that since Saudi Arabia recalled its fighters, Erdogan has taken over as the godfather of Al-Qaeda in Syria, hoping to colonise the country once it has been destroyed by civil war. CIA on the back foot over torture and 9/11. The Washington Post has revealed more details of the US Senate inquiry into the CIA's torture programs, now said to have been stopped by the Obama regime, if we can believe them. The main points of the Senate report are that even CIA officers were shocked at the levels of torture. CIA bosses repeatedly lied in saying the torture was getting useful information, and CIA HQ overruled its own analysts to order continuing torture of prisoners who analysts judged to have no more useful information. Perhaps the most damaging revelation for the Washington elite, however, is the news that the highly controversial report fails to recommend any punishment at all for the criminals in the CIA. Already President Obama has given the job to the CIA itself to censor pre-publication the report. Meanwhile, here in the UK, the Daily Telegraph has been told by a source in Whitehall that Blair and then Foreign Secretary Jack Straw definitely knew about the torture programme. This is significant because it could mean that they are accessories to a crime against humanity by supervising the illegal rendition flights which took the torture victims through and over the UK. Bizarrely, the Washington Post has itself colluded in America's torture programme by refusing to use the word torture, instead using the misleading phrase enhanced interrogation techniques. Now its reporters, while still avoiding the T word, are describing the techniques as excruciating. Meanwhile, the CIA's scams prior to the 9/11 attacks are coming under ever more scrutiny. The story is presented in the media as concerning Saudi Arabia government links to 9/11, but it is widely accepted by experts that the Saudis were merely a foil for the CIA. Now a Florida judge has ordered the FBI to hand over its files on a key Saudi national suspected of helping establish the 9/11 hijackers or patsies in the US prior to the 9/11 attacks. This is significant because normally all cases like this go before a coterie of judges in New York who are guaranteed to keep the lid on the CIA's 9/11 secrets. Watch this space. New free power claims stir debate. A company called Blacklight Power has announced a public demonstration of its claims to be able to use water to generate a massive burst of light, which it then captures using photovoltaic cells. Is this a revolutionary source of free power, or just a scam? Well, it seems that no one is too sure. Blacklight Power say their results have been independently corroborated, that they have raised millions of dollars in investment, and that they can explain the theoretical basis for their invention. In a world where Oxford University boasts of its plans to create a subatomic computer, the theoretical underpinning for this free energy type invention does not seem impossible. The inventors claim that they are collapsing hydrogen atoms to form so-called hydrinos and unleashing atomic-type energy levels. Whichever side of the issue you are on, it draws attention to the system's preference for King Kong. Kong stands for coal, oil, nuclear and gas. These are all technologies which force centralized production, and given that the raw materials are often fought over and looted from countries like Iraq, help to boost the military-industrial complex. One thing is sure, quite apart from Blacklight Power, there are many proven technologies that can already replace King Kong, and if Blacklight Power proves to be another, we can expect well-paid fake bloggers to do their best to undermine them. Meanwhile, researchers in California have analysed the costs of wind power and found that at 8 cents per kilowatt hour, it is cheaper than anything except gas. Nuclear power comes out at 10.8 cents and coal at 12.3 cents, as well as two alternative energy sources, solar 14.4 cents and biomass 11.1 cents. Only natural gas is cheaper than wind, averaging 6.6 cents per kilowatt hour. But researchers point out that there are few hidden costs with wind power, while fracking for gas pollutes groundwater, and nuclear, well, the costs of the ongoing Fukushima disaster are literally impossible to compute. That's why insurance companies refuse to cover nuclear power. We've been talking a lot about Ukraine recently, but there is another hotspot which could grow to crisis proportions at any time, and that's Venezuela, where again the US are trying to remove a democratically elected government. There have been 2 months of protest. Protests have turned violent with deaths reported. An opposition leader has been jailed. President Maduro blames the US for encouraging the protests and expelled US diplomats. In reply, the US did the same to Venezuelan diplomats. So Fran, you've been looking into this. Where are we now?
Well, Ian, the situation in Venezuela is tense and getting polarised. Students started to demonstrate against Maduro in Caracas in January of this year. Jailed opposition leader Leopoldo Lopez called for his supporters to take to the streets and force the exit of President Maduro, as he, along with other opposition leaders, can't accept that Maduro was democratically elected, albeit by a slim majority, and pro-Maduro supporters have held counter-demonstrations.
What are the anti-government protesters complaining about?
Well, their grievances are cited as the high rate of murder, kidnapping and robbery, and of food shortages and rising unemployment. As with every country, Venezuela's economy is affected by the global financial crisis. Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in Latin America. The opposition don't like oil revenue being spent on social programs, and they don't like the oil aid that's given to developing nations. Oil is sold at a low price to prevent unsustainable debt. Compare this approach to a typical US approach of high interest, creating a debt trap. Do Venezuelans really want profits from their oil to go to the foreign corporations' shareholders instead of Venezuelan people and public services? That's likely to happen if the opposition does become the government, who with US support would probably privatise public services, adopt a so-called free market agenda, introduce IMF loans, plunging Venezuelans into debt and even worse, poverty. Western media mostly are reporting on the opposition side, prompting an open letter to the Guardian newspaper signed by many people such as John Pilger, Ken Loach, MPs, lawyers and a lot of others, titled "Violent Protests Will Not Help Venezuela." And only when the Guardian received this letter did they start to report on both sides of this conflict.
What about the reports of fatalities?
Both sides dispute the numbers of fatalities and the identities of the perpetrators. Some say about 39 deaths have happened so far. The opposition are claiming that protesters have been killed by security forces, whilst the Chavistas, that's the pro-Maduro people, claim that protesters have killed Chavistas and non-aligned civilians. And anti-government protesters have put up blockades preventing free movement of people and goods, exacerbating a pre-existing food shortage. Deaths have occurred at barricades by people crashing into them in the dark. Others have been shot by men guarding the barricades. Others have died trying to get to hospital as they were refused to pass. And people trying to dismantle the barricades, such as farmers, were also killed. And shockingly, wire placed across roads decapitated some motorbike riders. And anti-government protesters have burnt 40 new metro buses, trucks transporting food, and set markets on fire. And the cost of damages to public infrastructure is about $1.6 million. How is burning public buildings, disrupting food supplies and public transport justifiable?
Well, it doesn't seem that justifiable. What about Maduro's claim of US interference?
John Pilger made a film about a failed US CIA-backed 2002 coup against President Chavez. And with links to this coup to opposition leaders, there appears some substance to President Maduro's accusations that right-wing extremists are backed by the US and are seeking another coup. The US sees Venezuela as hostile to US interests, as US multinationals cannot exploit Venezuela's oil or resources for their own private profit. US hawks are eager to replace Venezuela's government with a US and corporation-friendly one. As Bill Fletcher Jr. from the US Institute for Policy Studies says, despite the fact that the Maduro government has popular support, US politicians are laying the foundation for regime change. The National Endowment for Democracy is an organisation funded by US Congress. It's been active in Venezuela since 1997 and admits on its website it's been funding so-called democracy projects in Venezuela. It was the NED funding that was used in all the colour revolutions in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, incidentally. NED's former director, Professor Weinstein, admitted that a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA, and that's a quote from the Washington Post dated 22/11/91. Kim Skypes, PhD, author of a book on US organisations involved in destabilising foreign governments, says that NED seeks to restore the rule of the elite, top-down democracy, and show who is boss in the US empire. So Maduro arrested some generals recently for plotting a coup with plans to create psychological chaos. If protesters in the US or UK sought to overthrow the government, the protesters would be treated as terrorists.
Do we know what the majority of Venezuelans think?
Many Venezuelans see the opposition protesters as largely middle class and an educated elite, detached from ordinary people, and also their links with the failed coup make ordinary Venezuelans suspicious of them. A popular measure has been to use the oil revenue to fund public services such as free health care, education and house building, which help the majority of Venezuelans who most of them live in poverty. Luis Leon, Director of Data Analysis, said the opposition hasn't convinced the poor that it's capable of governing in their interests.
So what's Maduro going to do to resolve the situation?
Venezuela seeks an investigation by the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR. Maduro has called for a national peace conference and is also setting up a truth commission to investigate claims of unlawful killings by both opposition and security forces, and to investigate interference from foreign powers. The commission will invite all sections of society, such as religious groups, NGOs, journalists, lawyers and opposition representatives. Maduro has asked everyone to sign an agreement to renounce violence as a method of doing politics. The opposition is writing its own report accusing the government of crimes against humanity, despite the Attorney General stating that everyone, including the army, will be punished according to the Venezuelan constitution and the law if any offences are proven.
Well, Fran, thanks for that report. Actually, while hoping that Venezuela figures a way to maintain democracy and defend itself from outside destabilisation, unlike Ukraine, with its corrupt oligarchy that has now changed sides, Venezuela poses a challenge to everybody in the West to back basic social democracy. And some people would say that Maduro is excessively cautious. James Petras, a Latin American expert, has said that the opposition in Venezuela should be seen as crypto-fascist and it can only be dealt with by recognising that they are in a criminal conspiracy to overthrow democracy. They want to exploit Venezuelan oil for themselves and not for Venezuelans. Well, now we come to our guest interview, and our guest in the studio today is Chis Covendale of Make Wars History. And Chris argues that actually war is illegal and that our government has been breaking the law for many years now and many wars, and they're all illegal. So Chris, can you explain this?
Yes, basically for more than 50 years our governments have said that the wars they're fighting overseas are lawful or legal, and my research tells me that that is absolutely incorrect. And
why? Can you give it? What's the case for that? You know, why do you say that?
Well, basically, it's perhaps just useful to know a little bit about international law. Yes. In 1928, the world, after the horrors of the First World War, the world set up and signed and ratified a thing called the Treaty for the Renunciation of War. It has it's often called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And that, the nations, 63 nations eventually signed up to it. And it says we will never wage war and we will settle all our disputes peacefully. The Nuremberg war crimes trials used the Kellogg-Briand Pact as the basis for the trial and conviction of Germany's leaders after the Second World War.
Did it really?
And so it was.
So they acknowledged it even after the Second World War. They were still keeping to that act, that's international law, that item of international law.
And it is still in force. It is the world's most important law ever, I have to say, that bans war, makes it a criminal offence. So after the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1945, there was the UN Charter, and that really was an agreement between the nations of the world never to threaten or use force. Now, we've ignored that ever since. The next thing on the agenda was really the Nuremberg Principles. In 1950, the United Nations set out the crimes associated with waging war. They're known as the Nuremberg Principles, and they're very clear, making it a crime to prepare or involve oneself or wage a war.
Right.
That is a crime against peace under the Nuremberg
And preparing includes propaganda.
Absolutely.
So all those commentators who say we must be ready to go to war, or we should go to war, or we should take forceful action, or we should intervene when they mean militarily, they are potentially
They are committing
criminals.
a criminal offence. In fact, the Nuremberg Principle number 7 is complicity in a crime against peace and or a war crime, and the action of complicity is exactly the sort of things that you were pointing out.
Yeah.
Endorsing it, supporting
Advocating
it, financing it, whatever. Now, those are the first 3 laws. The fourth one happened in 1970, which is the Declaration on Principles of International Law, which is probably the most important legal advice about warfare and the use of armed force ever produced.
Right.
It came about because in 1962, several of the smaller members of the international community in the UN said, look, the big countries are waging war, Vietnam and other sort of things, against the principles of the UN. And we need to do something about it. So they asked the International Law Commission to bring out an interpretation of, a clear interpretation of the meaning of the UN Charter. And it was that was eventually formed in 1970, the Declaration on the Principles of International Law. And it's very clear.
Did Britain sign that?
Oh, absolutely. We are a member of the UN, and we agreed it, along with all the 195 other nations, that these are the principles of international law which we will abide by.
How extraordinary. So,
and yet nobody's ever heard of it.
No, because the media haven't told us about it.
And the government hasn't told us about it. Now, one of the things, when you sign an international treaty on behalf of the people, it's very important to tell the people what you have signed.
Yes.
The fifth law, international law, which is probably the most important of all, is the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court.
Right.
And that not only laid down the law, but it set up a law enforcement system that is universal, but is at the moment only applies to 122 nation states. Now that is a very important international law, which makes it a crime to wage a war of aggression. It makes it a crime to commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide, and it makes it a crime to be of conduct ancillary to those crimes.
So when America invaded Iraq and the French said, well, we're not going along with it, but they can fly over our country.
That would be an endorsement of it. Yeah. Although America is not signed up to the International Criminal Court, Britain is. And this is where the trial of Tony Blair really needs to focus.
The Brits say, well, we never made this UK domestic law. It's a rather sneaky little argument. Well, but I have heard that argument put.
And it's totally incorrect. They introduced the International Criminal Court Act in 2001, which should have been called the Genocide, Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. And it makes it a crime for anyone to get involved in any of those crimes in Britain. And it's English criminal law.
How extraordinary that they would that they would have done that when they were, you know.
It became law on the 1st of October 2001, and on the 7th of October, Tony Blair breached it by invading and occupying Afghanistan. So
it's not so fanciful to think that Blair could end up in jail at some point.
Absolutely. Almost a certainty eventually, if we apply the law. The real issue is that for 50 years we have been deceived about the illegality of war. All war is illegal and has been so, and all the actions associated with war are illegal. So killing a person because of their nationality is a crime of genocide, which is clearly defined in the domestic and international legislation.
How interesting.
Attacking another state, using weapons to destroy villages and towns and cities and so on. These are crimes against humanity as defined in both the Rome Statute for international law and in the International Criminal Court Act if it's a British citizen involved in the crimes.
So what's to stop somebody going to the police and saying, well, please would you bring a case against these people?
Absolutely nothing, and in fact that's what we ought to do.
Right.
Now unfortunately our police, they are corrupt, unfortunately. I have been to the police more than 300 occasions in the last 12 years. Only 5 of those have ever gone as far as the Crown Prosecution Service.
And quash the case.
And they're corrupt as well, and they they quashed the case on really crazy reasons. For instance, last time they said we will not charge Tony Blair on the grounds that he didn't intend to commit genocide,
didn't intend
war
to
crimes, or crimes
a
against
war.
humanity, which is again a lie. It is
An absolute offence.
It is, and he quite clearly, we have the evidence showing intent. He knew what he was doing.
Well, he gave the orders to the military to invade. I mean, how can that not be intent? Well, thanks very much, Chris.
Thanks.
Well, that's the end of this episode of Take Two. Thanks very much for watching, and thanks to the People's Voice for hosting us. You can watch all of our shows again on our RADTV UK YouTube channel.